okay? Ladies and gentlemen, just before we begin, may I kindly crave your indulgence for those who are in the back right over there. We would like to fill up some of our spaces over here because the optics for the camera do not look too good at this point. So it'll just take you a few seconds. If you could just kindly relocate, that would be gratefully appreciated. Thank you very much. We will begin our session in just about 5 minutes. Thank you for your patience. Good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I'm Victor Oladokun, the Director of Communication and External Relations at the African Development Bank, and it's my great pleasure to be your moderator during this morning's session on the future of work and industrialization here at the Bexco Center in Busan, Korea. You are welcome. Well, as the President of the African Development Bank constantly reminds and admonishes, the future is yesterday, and we are already late. So on that note, we will get proceedings going, but before we do, kindly allow me to introduce our very distinguished panel. To my immediate left is Her Excellency, Madam Kani Diallo, the Distinguished Minister of Planning and International Cooperation in the Republic of Guinea. Please give her a warm Busan welcome. And to her left is none other than the Honorable Kenneth Ofori-Atta, the Finance Minister of Ghana, who, as you all know, is doing great things in his country. Again, please give him a very, very warm welcome. The last but certainly not the least of our distinguished panel is none other than His Excellency, Mr. John Dramani Mahama, former President of the Republic of Ghana. Mr. Mahama is a communication expert. Actually, he's many things rolled into one. He's a historian. He is a writer, public speaker, a business person, passionate about innovation, creativity, and agriculture, as well as the youth. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome to the panel Mr. Mahama. Again, give him a warm welcome.
Thank you.
Undoubtedly, our continent is a tremendously blessed one. Great resources in land, in water. But our greatest resource is neither in commodities, nor oil or gas. Our greatest resource is the boundless energy and creativity of our young people. So, it stands to reason, therefore, that the future of work in Africa and the future of industrialization will be young. This young and youthful profile that we have means that the destiny, the industrial destiny of Africa lies in their hands. This young and youthful profile also means that our youth, the large population that we have, will no doubt be a competitive advantage for us in Africa. But let's think about this for a moment. The future is never predetermined. The future is a choice. The future is in our hands. The scenarios before us really will be the result of the choices that are made at a governmental level, the private sector, with all hands being on deck. The truth of the matter is that as we visit and as we see the miracle that is taking place here in South Korea, the fact of the matter is the same can be replicated over and over again in different parts of Africa. But I guess that's the crux of the issue here. There are many questions that we have that are burning that we would like to ask, and we will encourage you during this session to certainly put your questions together. There will be opportunities to come back to the audience. When we do come back to you with the microphone, kindly introduce yourself and ask your question. With an emphasis underlined, Arial, bold, size 72. Please note it's a question and not a comment. So make your questions precise and direct them to specific members of the panel. So, as your moderator, I subscribe to the New Africa, where introductions no longer exceed the length of speeches. So, without further ado, I will now call on President John Mahama to give us his introductory remarks. So, ladies and gentlemen, once again, please give President Mahama a warm welcome to the podium.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Victor. Thank you very much. I had lined up a long list of salutations of all the dignitaries, but it appears they're not here. And so I'll just say, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, and if I'm to borrow from my cousins in Nigeria, all protocols observed. I'll take a cue from the experience of the story that is told about somebody who gave a very long speech, very technical, and so obviously very boring. And the hall was full. As he spoke on and on, people kept slipping out until there was only one person left. And he continued for a further half an hour with only one person listening. And so when he finished, he was curious to find out why this guy had stayed and listened to the whole speech. And so he asked him, he said, while I was speaking, everybody was slipping out, and eventually was left with only you. Why did you stay and listen to my whole speech? He says, because I'm the speaker after you. Of course, there was no longer any audience to speak to. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to speak randomly, very broadly on a host of issues so that we can set the foundation for the conversation. But we're talking about the future of work and industrialization in Africa. There's been the first industrial revolution, there's been the second, there's been the third, and there's been the fourth. Indeed, Africa has missed out on most of these revolutions. And the question is, with the advent of the fourth industrial revolution, how is Africa going to take advantage of its potentials to be able to improve the life and prosperity of its citizens. Of course, the fourth industrial revolution is a revolution that uses more innovation and therefore means that it has a tendency to provide less employment. Indeed, because of digital technology, artificial intelligence, robotics, and all that are associated with the fourth industrial revolution, it has the potential to create more unemployment on the African continent. But let's take a background of the context in which all this is happening. Africa has a rapidly growing population with what we describe as a youth bulge. And so we have 60% of our population 35 years and below. It's often said that this is a great asset, but at the same time, it is the greatest threat to the stability and security of Africa. Because if it's not harnessed in the provision of decent jobs, then we're going to have major social issues, some of which we're beginning to see already in our countries. It is said that by 2050, Africa's population will be above 2 billion. And if you come back and zero in on our own sub-region, West Africa, Nigeria, our neighbors, will be above 300 million people. Ghana, our country, which is currently 30 million, would add another 20 million people, 50 million. Great market, great boost for productivity and industry, but at the same time, a threat in terms of unemployment and lack of jobs. And so we would see increases in pressure on social services. You have to build more schools, more hospitals to be able to provide the basic social services to the population. And we're beginning to see that already. We have a phenomenon we call schools under trees in Ghana. And we keep identifying them and rooting them out. But as you root out the schools and the trees, new communities are setting up, and they don't have a school, and they start a school and a tree. And so it's like a revolving cycle. You're having to chase the population with the school infrastructure. Aside from that, we must be innovative in how we harness this potential for job creation. And so while we're looking to increase jobs in the system and provide employment to the people, we must also be watchful of the rate of population growth. And so one of the things that we are seeing is increasingly more women are going to school. And as women go to school, they opt to have fewer children. And that's the fact. And that's why birth rates are beginning to fall in many countries in Africa. But like a train that is braking, it will take some additional distance before it is able to stop. And so while the population continues to increase, what do we do to ensure that there's a future of work and industrialization for our people? In the opening speech, the president of the African Development Bank, emphasized that Africa has advantages. And there's one particular advantage he continues to emphasize, and that is that 65% of the remaining arable land in the world is in Africa. And that's a big advantage for production. And considering that Africa has a comparative advantage when it comes to agriculture and agro-processing, maybe that is one area we must target in terms of creating jobs for the teeming populations in our country. And as we're told in the opening by both the AFDB president and the deputy minister of Korea, naming various statistics, it is said that we have 12 million young people entering the job market every year. Unfortunately, only about 30% of them would be able to find decent, stable jobs. It means that the remaining 70% will not be able to find jobs and continue to add on to the increasing unemployment in Africa. Specific statistics from the African Development Bank says that, and it's called the Jobs for Youth in Africa 2016 report, 420 million youth aged between 15 and 35. 1/3 are unemployed and discouraged. Another 1/3 are vulnerably employed in the informal, low productivity sector. And that the greatest challenge is faced by female youth. And so again, women are at a disadvantage here. Over the years, there have been suggestions as to how Africa can tap its full potential and create new jobs. And these include smart tech agriculture and harnessing our comparative advantage in agro-processing. It includes the huge opportunities that are opening up in the area of digital economy and service industry. It includes development of light industry and transitioning into heavy industry. And very importantly, includes value addition through refining and processing of our raw natural resources. But let's look at the context in which this occurs. We have a colonial attitude we have inherited to work. The preference of work in Africa is for white-collar jobs. And there's a general cultural denigration of employment that requires us to use manual skills. And so graduates from all levels of our educational system are seeking employment in the public and the formal private sector. Our educational system puts all our young people, our children, on the same track towards a college education. And so from primary school through junior high into senior high, the intention is that we're graduating all of them into a college education. But not all of them have the capacity to go into higher education. So 40% continue into the universities, and then you have 60% who are unable to continue. And what happens is, it is only when they are unable to gain entry into universities that the alternative of a technical and vocational education is considered. And so it becomes an afterthought. After they finish secondary school, then he says, well, I couldn't go into university, so let me go into a vocational school or into a technical school or a polytechnic. And so the question is, what do we do? First and foremost, I believe that we must tap all our potential to accelerate economic growth. Because in accelerating economic growth and expanding the economy, you throw up naturally sustainable jobs. And so if we must keep ahead of the curve and be one step ahead of the rate of population growth in Africa, then it is said that African countries must grow at an average of above 8% per year to keep above the rate of population growth. And so that is the first thing we should push for. And happily, Ghana is growing at 8.1%. I hope that together we can all sustain this growth and continue to maintain it. But unfortunately, if you take for the whole of the continent, growth has been in fits and starts. We have booms and busts. I mean, Ghana is an example. There are times we grow at 8%. There was a time we grew at 14%, came back to 3.5%, then to 4%, and now to 8.5%. And so are we going to be able to maintain it consistently so that we're able to throw up sustainable jobs? One of the issues that I noted when I was president, and I kept talking about, was the educational mismatch between the educational system we inherited and industry and business. We have maintained the same curriculum even though the world of work has changed significantly. And so we have the public universities, we've built more of them. We have the private universities, we've built more of them. But there's an emphasis on training graduates in the humanities. And so we're churning out thousands of MBAs every year. We're churning out thousands of marketing graduates every year. We're churning out thousands of human resource graduates every year, but not as many in the science and technology and other technical courses, which the world of work is now seeking. And so when I was president, I arranged a dialogue between academia and business. And it was a one-day dialogue. The captains of industry were there, and the vice chancellors of the universities, the rectors of the polytechnics were there. And what came out clearly from that dialogue was that we didn't need as many of the graduates in humanities as we were churning out. There was a saturation in most of those fields. And I was telling the AFDB president about the saturation in humanities, and I talked particularly about marketing. And he says, what are we producing to market anyway, to produce so many graduates in that area? And so that has been the major problem. And so out of that conference, we decided that we were going to upscale technical and vocational education. And happily, the African Development Bank gave us $40.2 million for upgrading facilities in our technical schools, polytechnics, and technical universities across the country. And this was called the Development of Skills for Industry project. Very good project, and it has expanded the number of young people who can go into technical education and provided them with the facilities to have a quality outcome. But this dialogue was very interesting. There was one business owner who blurted out when it was his time to make a comment. He says, why will I invest in skills upscaling of young graduates when labor is so mobile today, and that when I finish training him, somebody will poach him with a higher salary? So he's not interested in skills upscaling because he doesn't want to train for somebody else to take. And so it means that government must take part of that responsibility in terms of skills upscaling for the young people. And that is why various programs are coming up. There's another interesting experience we had. We had a young oil and gas industry coming up. And we decided, following the experience we had shared with Nigeria and other countries, to introduce a local content law. This was very unpopular with the oil industry captains. It was unpopular with their governments. And indeed, even at the level of the presidency, I came under strong pressure from Western countries to drop the local content bill. But we persisted. And so in 2013, we passed a local content law that compelled the oil companies to look for local talent, to look for talent locally, workers locally. And as a result of that, we've been able to generate between 8,000 and 10,000 jobs in the oil and gas industry, which otherwise would have gone outside. And so these are some things that we probably can do. And there are many jobs in that area. For instance, there was an occasion where they had to lay a length of undersea pipe, but they had to weld it first. And there was a company looking for 300 master welders with the American certification in welding. They could find only 60 of them who were of the quality to be able to do the job that was required. And so they had to get a company to quickly train, the additional welders that they need over a short crash period to be able to deliver on the contract that they had. And so there are jobs coming out in welding, in plumbing, electricians, technicians, and so on and so forth. But like I said earlier, we're producing human resource, experts, we're producing MBAs, we're producing people in the areas where they can't find work. One important issue that I think African governments should look at is value addition. And the African Development Bank president said it for years, and let me take my country, Ghana, we've been exporting cocoa. We process only 28% of the cocoa that we produce. The remaining 71% is exporting raw beans. How many more jobs can't we create if we were processing 70% rather in Ghana and exporting 30% raw beans? There'll be more factories producing cocoa powder, cocoa rum, cocoa liquors, and so on and so forth. And so with the African Development Bank, they're working on a warehousing system to be able to store cocoa. But I think that one of the things we should do is to accelerate the processing of the product. Gold. Ghana is one of the top 10 producers of gold, 80 tons of gold a year. And yet most of it is exported in bullion form, raw gold. And yet if you look at the difference in price, international price of raw gold, and when it has been, purified to its highest degree, the vast difference in price that we could earn if we were refining the gold that we were producing would make a very significant difference in the earnings of the country. And so there are many other things we can do. Establishment of science and technology hubs. In Ghana, we have the Accra Digital System. We have the Free Zones Enclave. We have the Technology Park in Tema. and another one coming up in a collaboration we have with Mauritius. Then we have the industrial enclaves and special economic zones. That is the Ethiopian example, where you create special economic zones, you put in the factories, factory space, you put in the electricity, you put in the water, the roads, and everything the producer needs. Because then it reduces his risk. His investment is lower. He doesn't have to come and build a factory. He just rents the space and he starts producing. So that's an option that Africa can look at to give ready-made space for industrialists in other parts of the world who want to relocate to be able to take advantage. The era of mass employment industrial models is over. And so what development industrialization paradigm are we going to use? We're not going to have those huge factories where hundreds of thousands of people find employment. It will be more for smart, small, medium enterprises, so small business owners, creating the jobs that are needed. And so in the future, I can see entrepreneurs like a young man called Fahad, which session I attended yesterday, who is into agro-processing. I mean, he got the idea of processing cashews so that we stop exporting raw cashew nuts to India and then processing them and exporting them to Europe and to US and labeling them made in India, produced in India, when actually the nuts are from Cote d'Ivoire and from Ghana. And so people like that, I think, own the space going forward. Many government projects have been attempted, and one of those that I piloted was the Youth Enterprise Support Initiative. I think its version in Nigeria is called UWIN, where young people were asked to provide proposals for businesses. And then a board went through, chose the most viable of those businesses and provided them with capital to be able to start, and also training. Often we just concentrate on capital, but do not look at the training aspect. You can give a person as much capital as he wants. If you don't train him to be able to manage and run the business will collapse. And so those are things that we should look at. On International Youth Day, I went around to visit some of these young entrepreneurs, and there was one of them, a young iron worker. We had provided him with a welding machine and a molding plant. And because of that, he was working with only his brother. He had employed 2 more people as a result of the injection he had. There's a young guy who is a meat vendor. He provides meat, goats, meat, sheep, turkey, chicken to the restaurants in Accra. His basic need was a deep freezer, because after he supplied the meat, the one that was left, he didn't know what to do with it. He had to smoke it. But with a deep freezer, he could store it and thaw it the next morning and supply again. And so just giving him the deep freezer, changed things for him. There was a young lady who had finished University of Science and Tech in architecture and decided to go into aquaculture. And so we started her off with 20 cages, and today she employs 25 people in this venture. This is the future of work, empowering people not only with capital, but also with the training to be able to set up their own small businesses and be able to succeed. There's a lot that one can say, and as presidents and politicians, we're used to talking, but I guess that the more interesting part will be the panel discussion and the questions that you have to ask us. Thank you very much. Thank you.
President Mahama, thank you very much for those opening comments. Very much appreciated. You mentioned that the natural trajectory of industrialization is one that goes from agricultural production to manufacturing and then on to services. My question for you is this. In a number of African countries at the moment, that transition has either come to a grinding halt or is actually being reversed. So the specific question I have is this. What role does policy somersaults have in this quandary that we deal with right now? And the reason for that is, as you know, as a former president, many times policies in one government, rather than being long-term, are switched and changed in real time every 4 or 5 years. How can we industrialize it with that kind of situation?
The natural trajectory of the development is to transition from large agricultural societies into more service-oriented society. In Ghana, the overhaul took place in 2010. In 2010, for the first time, the services sector became the largest contributor to GDP, to growth, instead of agriculture. Agriculture had always been in the lead. And for the first time in 2010, it was overtaken by services. And today, the service sector is the fastest growing sector in Ghana. That includes banking and finance, telecoms, tourism, and all that. And so it is something that happens naturally. For African countries, I think it's delayed. It should have happened much faster. But the meat of your question is, how does policy disruption, delay this process or set it back? My country is a clear example of policy disruption. I can count the number of development plans that we've had since the 80s. And the most famous one was the Economic Recovery Program, which was implemented by the PNDC, Jerry Rawlings government. This was after Ghana had hit rock bottom. There was no further down we could go, and so naturally the only way was to come up again. And so with the IMF, there was a huge debate about it. It led to a bust-up in government. The socialists and strong communists, avowed communists who saw the international financial institutions as the devil itself, left the government. And the reformists decided to go to the IMF. It was a very tough time. They took away all subsidies to agriculture, to education, to health. That's how come we got the cash and carry system, where if you went to the hospital, you had to pay first before getting service. And so it was a very tough trajectory. And then later, to ameliorate it, they came with the program of action to mitigate the social cost of adjustment, called PAMSCAD. I mean, there were all kinds of funny experiments being carried out in our country. But take that all away. Then we went into the poverty and growth poverty reduction strategies. I mean, all the years, strategy 1, strategy 2, strategy 3, structural adjustment. I mean, so many. But from 1992, once we democratized and we entered a multi-party democracy, in Ghana, power has changed hands successfully between political parties 3 times now. And every 8 years, potentially, they can be changed. Now, even every 4 years, as I learned, because I was voted out after 4 years, they potentially can be changed. And so any new government comes.
But if we're to follow what you're saying, there's been a consistency of policy in Ghana relative to quite a number of other countries. What is it that other African countries can take away from Ghana in the same manner that Singapore has or Korea has? What are the lessons we can take away from
Well,
Ghana?
I think that the main thing that contributes to that in Ghana is that ideologically the 2 leading parties have come closer to the middle. And so the party that is called conservative is pursuing, social welfare models that normally extremist conservative governments will not. And the party that is socialist has moved to the center and is using the market to be able to drive the economy. And so there's a certain consensus ideologically, coming closer towards the middle. And so it's easy for us to understand and share policy. We try to come out with a 40-year development plan with our National Development Planning Commission. And it is my hope that we'll take a look at that plan and then across party lines decide if we must change some things in it and just adopt it by consensus and continue to follow that path.
Thank you very much, President Mahama. I'm going to come to Honorable Minister Kane Diallo. I would like to give you 3 to 4 minutes to respond to the earlier comments that President Mahama made.
Merci beaucoup. Je voudrais d'abord commencer pour
I'd like, first of all, to start by giving an overview of the situation of youth in Guinea. They represent 1/3 of the population there. We have a situation that I believe reflects the situation of development in the continent. We are a country that is rich in potential, and we have an economic situation that is improving, but we should normally be in a more favorable situation than the one we have now. It's true that we have been spoken about planning, the role of the state, the role of African governments in resolving problems. But to my mind, Africa is at a crossroads. We have tried a whole range of policies. We have identified the problems. We have well-developed planning documents. But the issue is with implementation. What is the role of the state in implementing the development objectives of a country? Of course, there are lots of changes with regard to government teams in every country. Almost we have a change once every 5 years of government teams. So there's disruption there, and this is hampering development. Now, the major employer is the state. So how can we tap into the potential of youth and integrate youth in economic development? With regard to Guinea, we developed an economic development plan. We identified the main issues, and it emerges that unemployment is the major one. About 83% of the unemployed are young people. So what can we do to integrate these people and bring them on board economic development? We find that there's a mismatch between training and the needs of the labor market, also a weakness in training. So what do we need to recommend by way of solution? The most important problem, to my mind, that Africa needs to bring solutions to is governance. We may change regimes, leaders, economic policy approach. Well, that may happen, but if we do not resolve the problem of governance, it will be a vicious circle. The issue of governance is there because there is no culture for competition. There is no culture of moving out of the public system so as to favor to facilitate the development of SMEs. So how can we then use public resources and harness them for an economic development that serves the populations? In Guinea, we have significant internal capacity in extractive industries, also in the agricultural sector, and we need to tap into the mining sector so as to further invest in agriculture. But this will not happen without improving governance in this sector. We know that the mining sector is not the major labor-intensive sector, so we need to, harness those resources that we get from the mining sector and to inject them in the whole value chain. So for me, the main issue is that of governance. Of course, it's good to realize that the issue of youth is on top of the agenda, but what can we do in order to, find a solution to this problem? Not just temporary solutions, but long-term training and the creation of SMEs. That is, act in such a way that the creation of wealth is based on public investment so as to generate significant resources in order to improve the quality of the life of the people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madame Diallo. I'm going to come to Honorable Oforiatta here, and I just want you to pivot on what President Mohammed said a few moments ago. Just by way of background, my grandfather was a cocoa farmer. To the best of my recollection, my grandfather never tasted a bar of chocolate. And as President Mohammed said, we, for generations, for decades, have not been able to add significant value to what it is that we produce, not just cocoa, but other commodities. So my question to you is, what is it that Africa must do right now to change this scenario? And how is it that we cannot determine the prices of our commodities? My grandfather's cocoa prices always went up and down depending on the vagaries of the markets in Europe. But the last I checked, the prices of chocolate have never gone down, the prices have always gone up. So what is it that we can do to take our own destiny in our own hands and change the current scenario where we're not able to add value in the manner that we should?
Victor, that's very embarrassing. Characterization of where we are. And I think, you know, it's a very sad situation because you have a situation where we have upended the very basic core of capitalism, which essentially says that when I bring equity money, I own the enterprise and therefore generate the profits. So if we assume the seeds of cocoa to be the equity that leads to the building up of this 120, 140 billion enterprise, how come we are taking just a 6 billion participation as opposed to benefiting from that? And I think it's really just a sad reflection on the educated elite, because the farmer for 60 or 80 years has been delivering these cocoa seeds to us, who are the elite in governance or in administration, of their cutlass wounds and snake bites. And we sit at our cocoa boards and have not found a way to participate in the value add so that we could actually be stabilizing the price and or paying the farmer more than the world producer price because you're participating in the melting and I think that's really the challenge that we have to confront. So recently, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, about 60-65% of the world's cocoa beans, are beginning now to dialogue to say, how can we be the higher percentage of the world's price delivery and we are still price takers? It makes no sense. So either we are going to begin to have storage systems so we can manage this, or we are going to begin to participate in the middle end or the top end of the value chain so that you then control the prices, or you are going to begin to take shareholding in the Cadbury's, etc., so that you sit at the table to determine how the price goes. And why should the commodities exchange for cocoa be in Chicago or London as opposed to in Accra or Abidjan? I think those are very fundamental questions, and it is. I think this new generation has the opportunity to question the current paradigm and say no more. And that's why, you know, issues of the strength of the Africa Development Bank becomes important, both in capital and human resource, because then we can really take very firm positions in how we negotiate to bring a new economic order. So the issue of the Continental Free Trade Agreement is not one not to recognize the significance, because then you are beginning to disable the ability of the West to treaty shop or work country by country you're going to have to confront this 1.3 billion market with 2.5 trillion GDP and only one entryway with regard to that, so that we change that. So I think there really are exciting times ahead as you begin to look at this new generation that is absolutely comfortable to really confront the current system of world economic order and say no more. We are not going to do that. And we've been to the same schools with you. We understand what you do. What is it that has made us so timid, you know, in the past 50 years? And what are the selfish interests that has prevented us from really looking to the benefits of your grandfather, the cocoa farmer? Because, you know, also in a sense, we can prove that if the calculus of the distribution is changed, the enhancement in productivity and consumption to the African people really increases sort of global productivity in a positive way, and nobody can then, you know, fight against that. We just need to get our ship in order and move to seize the moment.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but probably I just might. But I'd like for you to unpack a statement that the President of Ghana made recently, which is a very bold and profound statement, but obviously it needs some unpacking here, and no better person to do that for us than yourself today. He has said that Africa does not need aid, and has been very, very blunt about this. What is he saying specifically? Because there are definitely still some countries that do need aid, but again, there's another message here. Your take on that?
Victor, I think, I mean, essentially what President Akufo-Addo is saying is Ghana beyond aid and Africa beyond aid. It's not necessarily saying you don't need help to go forward. But how do you, looking at our resource envelope, you know, how do you create a self-confident and ready population to leverage off on the resources that we have and opportunities for all? So we are beginning to define that and put some body on it. How do you create a wise society? Wealthy, inclusive, sustainable, and empowered. And within that construct is then your ability to train your people for the future, the ability to sit and negotiate because you are confident in what you are doing, your ability to leverage upon your resources to really unpack the benefits to yourself. He's also saying that we cannot continue in a regime in which we have what we call illicit financial flows of 50 billion a year, which is about 1 trillion if you look at 1960 to now. Now we don't need to be receiving aid if we were to change the dynamics of that. And the question to the world is, how can we be complaining that resources are reducing in the capitals in the West, whilst we look, you know, blithely at those same multinationals taking out 50, 60 billion of illicit financial flows? Because those flows are not issues of corruption from Africans, and 65% of it is due to commercial activities, transfer pricing, tax-based erosion, unbalanced contract, etc. And that has to be confronted. So a Ghana beyond aid and Africa beyond aid is, you know, a clarion call to really Africans to let's wake up and let's say no more, because in here are the resources and the capacity to do what we have to do.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, and I'm now going to come back to Madame Diallo here, particularly in your role as Minister. Planning fits squarely in what it is that you do for your country. Now, we live in a world of systems, actually a world of interconnected systems that impact one another, whether it be education, health, infrastructure, of roads, or whatever it might be. But in many of our countries, these systems are either broken, they're disconnected, they don't speak to one another. How is it that we can increase productivity and industrialize in the manner that we're talking about when we have this kind of dysfunctionality.
Absolument, je pense que là c'est le problème
Right.
essentiel
I believe this is the crux of the matter, and this is a problem that most African countries are grappling with. There's the whole systems actually depend on the public sector. In my country, the major employer is the state, which is already an anomaly in view of the potential that the country is replete with. The approach that we have elected to use is to recenter planning in development. That is, put it at the center of development and, issue documents in a standard form in conformity with the rules, and also to have all stakeholders on board so as to identify the real issues and propose solutions in such a way as not to have a system that is imposed by the center. So we conducted an assessment of the situation. We brought on board the local communities, the parliament, and other stakeholders, and we moved on to seeking out solutions. We also called on our technical and financial partners in the country to participate. And now we have a diagnosis that reflects the concerns of all stakeholders and also the realities of the country, so that we can have sustainable solutions. What is lacking in many countries is the continuity of the action of the state in putting in place far-reaching structural reforms that would lead to sustainable solutions. We often have economic development plans over 5 years, but then you have a change of government and then you start from scratch again. So it would be good to confer sustainability on the results that we achieve, and also learn from success stories outside of Africa. So we need to make sure that there's a rather limited influence by the center in decisions. In most countries, you have the political leadership that has it all, having an approach that is the result of a consultation with stakeholders is, I believe, an approach that could lead to sustainable solutions. And then what do we need to do afterwards so that the results obtained benefit the whole society? That's why I introduced earlier on the issue of governance, because we can have development, and if we don't change, if we don't attend to governance, then we can't have sustainable impacts. It is paradoxical to see the huge potential that we have and to see other countries benefit from this wealth while this is denied our populations. So we sometimes find ourselves in situations where people, take to the sea and die in search of greener pastures on the other side. I believe then working with all stakeholders will lead us to durable solutions. Also, sustainability depends on stability. Political stability is fundamental in Africa. when we go for elections, then we have at least 1 or 2 years lost in challenging the results of the elections. Why don't we try to have real dialogue in the country and real solutions, and that we agree on ways of managing public affairs? So we need then to revisit and improve governance, and if we do that, then we will achieve sustainable results when we conduct a reform. Otherwise, there will be no easing of the economic situation of the population. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. My next two questions are in this order, first to President Mahama and then to Honorable Ofori-Atta. My first question is this. You've talked about the fact that technologies, robotics, quantum computing, and the whole 9 yards that go along with the fourth industrial revolution are going to disrupt society and economies as we know them. It used to be that in the past, large populations were actually a competitive advantage. That no longer seems to be the case as we move into this new technological age. So my question is Africa really ready for the fourth industrial revolution? If not, why not? And if yes, what gives you such optimism?
Well, I have absolute faith in Africa's ability to bounce back. And I would say that even though there are very steep challenges facing the continent, we have the kind of human resource that it takes to be able to leapfrog and be able to enjoy the benefits of the fourth industrial revolution. Take the telecom sector, of which I played a very key role in deregulation of the old state-owned telcos. And at the time we did it, we did not anticipate that there was going to be such a breathtaking explosion in terms of telecoms and ICT on the continent. Today, the continent has the fastest growing, mobile penetration in the world. The continent has the fastest growing mobile money transactions and other things. So nothing is impossible. I do believe that even though Africa was not affected by the second and third industrial revolutions, there is always the ability to leapfrog and be able to join the rest of the world going forward. Even though we have a fast-growing population, and I was listening to the president of the World Bank when he spoke about the reduction in mass employment, he used Bangladesh as the example. And he said that labor engagement in terms of industrial employment is going down in Bangladesh because even there, where they have the center of the textiles and garments industry, they're introducing technology to be able to be competitive and reduce their cost. And so they're bringing machines from Germany, machines called sewbots that are replacing workers in terms of sewing. And so what do you do with all that displaced labor? And that is the question. Must we have graduates coming out of school who are looking for only work in the public sector? That is where innovation must come in, small startups. And that's why, as president, I set up the Accra Digital Center, which has the capacity for 10,000 startups, incubators, innovation centers, and all that. And when we opened it, we invited young Ghanaians to exhibit. And you'd be awed by the breadth of the innovation and thinking that they have. I think that what is needed is the opportunity. Unfortunately, all these young innovators cannot find the capital to be able to put a lot of these ideas into implementation. And so that's where government comes in. We have a program starting, which is called the Nation Builders Corps, in which the government wants to employ 100,000 graduates over the next 3 years, pay them about $150 a year. This program will be successful if only it comes with one, skill upscaling, and then two, giving them the opportunities to become entrepreneurs rather than just wait to be absorbed into the public sector. We have a public sector of 600,000 people, public sector employees, and every year we're throwing onto the job market from the universities at least 60,000 graduates for a public sector of 600,000. I mean, how many are you going to be able to take in? Already we're having problems with employing nurses, teachers, because we're overproducing, all these people. How are we going to be able to direct some of them into other areas where they can create jobs for themselves and become employers instead of employees?
Thank you very much. And that leads to my next question to Honorable Oforiatta here. As you said earlier, President Mahama, you mentioned that 11 million graduates come into the job market every single year, but there are only 3 million job opportunities. So my question is this: how do we turn this huge potential, how do we take advantage of this huge potential rather than allowing it to become a ticking time bomb? Is there a sense of urgency among our governments concerning this huge youth bulge that is going to hit 800 million by the year 2050? Where are the jobs? What are we going to do? Is there a sense of urgency here? We've talked about the fact that technology is making the job situation a whole lot more precarious. What are we doing as governments to preempt this inevitability that's right before us?
Victor, that's sort of a Delphic oracle question. I don't know. But I mean, it is what...
In Ghana, we have Antoine.
We have what?
Antoine Yama.
Antoine Yama, yes. We can go to the oracles and do that. But I think it is what finance ministers go to bed just grappling with. And it was interesting for me to realize that in Korea, they call it the Ministry of Strategy and Finance, and that makes sense. Because we are confronted with this demographic dividend or disaster or national security risk if we don't tackle it. So you have interventions like what FDR did, in the war period after that, and that's what we come up with the Nation Builders Corps, almost like a holding pen as you get people to begin to at least get some dignity in life. And as our president has just said here, to now dovetail it with real skills for the future. So what we're going to do, I'm not sure that there's an immediate, solution to absorb these 12 million people, but clearly our educational intervention has to be different.
In what way?
In terms of technology. I mean, I think the whole pedagogy has to change. It would be, as I begin to do analysis strategy, it might be cheaper for me to give, every child or every citizen a free smartphone because I can then put on it all of the applications that are relevant for a better agricultural production, for better marketing, for better education, etc. And those real analysis have to be done, and I have to begin to be able to say that that's not subsidizing, that is going to lead to a more educated population, and my ability to tax them, and my ability to also transmit the various social interventions that are relevant for them.
What about the possibility of making entrepreneurship part of the curriculum all through secondary and university education?
I think that's the issue of pedagogy that I was talking about. That has to be, essentially transformed. I mean, what is the point, as our president said, of going through this academic, tedium? But actually, Victor, the sad part about this is that even that we are not delivering properly. So there's a law which says that you have to take your child to school. So from 6 to 18, a parent, quote unquote, sacrifices that. And then at the end of the period, that child is not well educated or not ready for the future. And that's criminal by a state, and that has to be reversed. And I think technological intervention is really going to be key, so that from any corner of Ghana or the continent, I can get to you an educational platform, that would enable you to prepare for the future. And I think that's the type of society that we should really be spoiling for. And when I talk about, bringing technology into the classroom so that people can then begin to look at themselves also as entrepreneurs going forward, there's a lot of fear also about the fourth industrial revolution, because you are now beginning to make things so much more efficient that the former sort of labor-intensive areas are going to shrink. And so what are you doing? This is where entrepreneurship comes. So it's not an issue of me creating 100,000 jobs through one enterprise, but it's me creating 100,000 people who would have ability to create certain jobs that they have to. And in addition to that, it's the savings that come with it. Because if I can then have the farmer to be more productive, it means that the $2.2 billion that I'm spending on importing food is now eliminated. And that then can go into high-tech industrialization, etc., to get my people going. It also will help me in terms of delivering efficiencies, because I can then not have to depend on my officer who might be corrupted, but I can send drones to be able to test whether that road was actually built to the specifications that we had paid for. And that begins to change, sort of efficiencies and savings that we can have.
Okay. I'm going to, thank you very much, Honorable Forieta. I'm going to come to the floor right now with questions from the audience, and then come back later on with a few follow-up questions for us. But I'd like to go first to the Director of Human Capital and Youth and Skills Development at the African Development Bank, Ali Divawada, who's actually in the audience way in the back over there. I just wanted you to share with us very, very quickly what it is that the African Development Bank is doing with its Presidential Youth Advisory Group, as well as Jobs for Youth in Africa, and how it is that African nations can take advantage of these initiatives.
Thank you very much, Victor. I think the African Development Bank is trying to take a different approach, but similar to what the discourse is now. We're not even talking about the fourth industrial revolution. The fifth industrial revolution has crept in on us, and it's called the quantum leap. So we've missed the first, we've missed the second, we've missed the third, the fourth is exiting, and the fifth is creeping in. What the bank is trying to do now is to try and create 25 million jobs over the next 10 years, a very ambitious plan, a very ambitious vision, but looking at three different pillars. One is looking at innovation, the other is looking at agriculture, and the third is looking at industrialization. And we are looking at different areas. We're trying to look at the entire ecosystem of job creation. We're trying to set up centers of excellence, looking at coding for employment. We're trying to build innovation labs, linking youth to the job market, linking them to private sector researchers, and so on and so forth. We're also trying to provide startups for entrepreneurship, encouraging more youth to go into the agriculture sector, linking skills enhancement zones to crop enhancement zones. So there's a whole shopping basket of things that the bank is trying to do to address some of these. And in addition to that also, as you rightly mentioned, the president had set up the Presidential Youth Advisory Group, identifying CEOs, young CEOs under the age of 35, some of whom are actually billionaires, to provide advice to the African Development Bank, to look at what are the key emerging issues that are coming up on job creation. Is the bank on the right track? How we can link the African Development Bank with the youth to potential private sector entities, have discussions with policy makers, coming up with very innovative outside of the box thinking. So there are little different things that the bank is doing. Internally within the bank also, we are trying to ensure we put our money where our mouth is as well, to count the jobs that we are trying to create. Between 2016 and 2017, we've supported 277 projects that have actually created 1.6 million jobs. So there's a host of different things that the bank is trying to do, including mainstreaming jobs across the bank's programs and activities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali. We'll take our first question from the floor. Yes, in the back, blue shirt.
Thank you very much. And my question is addressed to President John Mahama.
Your name, please.
Sorry, my name is Taim Long Robert Afo. I'm from Cameroon. I'm a young professional at the African Development Bank Group. My question is addressed to President John Mahama. In your remarks, you mentioned that by 2050, Africa's population would be about above 2 billion people, and the risk posed by innovations in artificial intelligence, robotics, and information and communication technologies to job creation. My question is, would you advise African governments to implement public policies that check population growth by scaling down birth rates in order to reduce or mitigate the risk posed by population growth to job creation? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. We'll take the second question, and then we'll follow in that order. Mohammed Al Dashan, let's come to you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Thank you to the panel for your presence. My name is Mohammed Al Dashan. I run a consulting firm called Oxcon in England. My question is regarding the social safety nets related to jobs in the future. As we look at asking, instead of having one company that creates 10,000 jobs, we want to have 10,000 people create 1 or 2 jobs each. As we do that, that also means that people are relying on themselves, very often lacking the social safety nets that were characteristic of jobs over the past 50, 60 years. When people moving to the gig economy, when that Uber driver may be making money day in, day out, but when they're sick, they go hungry. Consequently, it's an opportunity to have you as policymakers here to ask you, where do you see the role of, how do we create improved social safety measures for health, for education, and so on, for people as jobs become increasingly fragile and precarious? Thank you.
And your question is directed to?
Whoever wishes to answer. It's an opportunity to have the 3 of them, so I wouldn't like to choose one.
All right.
But whoever would like to. Thank you.
We'll take the first question, President Mahama, and then we'll come back to Mohammed's question.
Yeah. Actually, in the presentation, I did make reference to the rapid population growth rate. Like I said, it is slowing, but it's slowing like a moving train, a braking train. It will go some distance before it stops. The extreme measure is like happened in China, the one-child policy. I don't prescribe one-child policy for Africa. Indeed, there will be a revolt if you attempted to introduce a one-child policy. But I believe in empowering women especially. With the Millennium Development Goals in Ghana, we achieved gender parity in primary school enrollment, as many girls going to school as boys. And we realized that as girls get educated, and first it delays their entry into marriage and childbirth, and secondly, when they go into childbirth, they opt for fewer children than if they didn't go to school. And so putting girls in school and keeping them in school as long as possible, up to tertiary education, is something that we must work at. That's the first thing. Aside from that, too, we must empower women to take control of their reproductive rights and be able to negotiate those reproductive rights in a much stronger way than currently society allows them to do. And also make sure that they have access to the instruments of family planning to be able to determine what family size they have and take those decisions and be working with their partners, be able to ensure that the children have a quality education and a quality life. And so these are the ways we should go. because, like I said, as the population grows, it has its advantages. A big market, I mean, 2 billion market in 2050, that means we must triple the amount of agricultural production. We must, just imagine the number of consumer goods and everything that have to be produced to feed 2-point-something billion people. But at the same time, the pressures on government making social services available is going to be a real challenge for most African economies. And so the current steps we're taking are helpful, but at the same time, some of the transformational decisions that we've passed, like the Continental Free Trade Area, that allows labor to move across our countries where there are deficits and be able to move goods seamlessly across the African continent, is something that will add a multiplier effect to all our countries. It will be a win-win for all of us. And so while we're looking at these population drivers, we must also look at the things that we can change in terms of the structures and systems that we currently have on the continent that will spare human creativity and move productivity forward.
And I guess I'll take the liberty of being the moderator to direct Mohamed's question to Madame Diallo here. As we look at a new economy that is no longer contingent on what the public sector or what government has to offer, how can the rights of this younger generation that we're asking to become self-employed and creative and innovative, how can those rights be protected, just as he asked?
Thank you.
I believe that the current situation of the youth in Africa reflects the lack of investments in the social sectors. Nowadays, the youth are in a situation where they are not quite prepared in terms of their training, in terms of, their orientation or guidance, as well as opportunities to access employment. So for several generations, we have failed in investing meaningfully and significantly in order for the youth to be able to deal with the current situation. We also have challenges in the area of health. For a country like Guinea that was plagued by a serious disease, we realized that for several generations we did not strengthen our health systems, and that led to the quick rise of that disease. And the role of the state of governments today is really to ensure that there are enabling conditions for the youth to get out of their predicament, and to ensure that they have an aligned training, aligned on the needs of the new businesses. The state therefore plays a key role in those two sectors, which boils down to investing significantly to prevent and especially protect this segment of the population, which is the most vulnerable. And also, this also applies to women, so we have to make up for lost time. What we've not been able to do, we might need to use shortcuts to find the appropriate solutions to, the precarious situation of the youth, rather.
About the birth rates, is kind of the old Malthusian acceptance that as population grows, we will not be creative enough to leverage our resources to do that. It's never happened. And I'm not sure there's a worry. I mean, if I look at the whole of the Sahel between Ghana and Libya, why have we not developed it? I mean, that's a whole potential to do things. If we look at our own economies, we've not leveraged them enough. I can't begin to worry about birth rates, about that, because I think the potential of people, if governments, are in control of what they want to do to deliver and have good governance, that will not be an issue. And what is wrong with a world in 2050 in which Africa is not only a quarter of the world, but maybe 35% of the world, leveraging on the resources that we own, the arable land, etc., to create this dominant society. That is how I will look at the question.
We're going to come back to the issues of work and industrialization in a moment, but I want to play the angel's advocate for a few moments here. For the younger generation listening to this panel, when it comes to dialogues of this sort, conferences, we have developed a tremendous capacity for pontificating and talking about issues. And we've been doing this for 40, 50 years, but nothing is changing, seemingly, on the ground. And we have a youth population that is tremendously frustrated with their lot in life, sometimes suspicious of the future. What is it that we can do as governments to give hope to this restless, young, energetic, and creative population? What is it that we can do?
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe it's no different than what Korea did, which was where's the centrality of our people in our planning and our strategy? How do I give the skill set to these people to use their intellect to be able to take care of themselves, essentially, have a dignity of life? Now that's my responsibility. How do I influence the education system today? How do I stabilize the economy? And how do I bring liquidity into the banks so that the youth can have access to venture capital funding or private equity or just credit? And if you see what we've been able to do over the course of the 17 months, it's saying, you know, if we can stabilize this economy, increase growth, if we can make the CD more stable, you then begin to open up to give some sense of hope. But in between there are the frustrations of, quote unquote, the lost generation. So you intervene with something like the Nation Builders Corps as a start. You begin to build up on the technology centers that our former president, has done. So that the sense of dignity is revitalized, and the sense of nationhood is also revitalized. Have I stabilized the National Health Insurance Scheme? That is good. Are people being able to go to school, and relevant school, more TVET and STEM as opposed to what we have? Unfortunately, the transmission, it can't be done, in a year. And whether governments can build trust in terms of reinstating the social contract between the body politic and government becomes then the key issue of creating that patience so that the dividend of demography does not turn into a disaster. So that there's no sort of immediate resolution except a clear path that everybody can acknowledge. Well, whether we like it or not, there has been movement in the stability of this economy for me to be able to do something. And I think that's a conversation that we should honestly have, as a people. That the facts are there, the people are there, there's a government, and it makes you accountable to the future. But I think, really, we cannot despair because we have so much in resources. But we also, as government, need to begin to confront the economic paradigm that we have inherited. Is this the way cocoa should go? Is this the way multinationals should be? Those are real issues that have to be put, at the center for people to feel like Africa is coming into its own and that we are defending the cause of the future.
Just adding quickly to that, I believe that they have the flair for creativity. We have this young generation of Africans who did not grow in the same conditions that we grew up in. They grew up being used to computers and being able to access knowledge on a scale far wider than we could ever have imagined when we were young people. And so when you sit and talk with them, you're impressed at the depth of creativity and knowledge that they have. And there are many of them that are not interested in the old traditional paradigm of employment. I mean, many of them are not interested in an 8-to-5 job. You know, they want to use their talents for something else. And so, like Ken was saying, creating the environment that allows that creativity to flourish is the number one, is the foundation. And that means stabilizing the economy, which is what we were trying to do in government, undertaking some painful fiscal reforms in order that the economy could breathe again and beginning to grow. And in that environment where the economy is growing, you know, they'll be able to find space for their creativity to be able to realize their full potential.
Thank you very much, President Mahama. Then we'll come back to the floor. Let me see, over on the left to right here. Then we'll come back over there.
Thank you. My name is Stephen Jaba from Ghana, Association of Ghana Industries. I'm listening to what we've heard, knowing how we want to accelerate industrialization in Africa. There are key players, apart from the youth, that we have not looked at. And in Africa, everywhere you go, we've been able to develop through our traditional authorities. And looking around this program, I've not heard anything. How do we get to these traditional authorities? Because they are more influential in society. And if you didn't know what ADB is doing, I believe they have a role to play to help us to reach to the communities where we really want people to go. Also looking at being here, how do the people that we left back home will be able to know what has discussed here? The media has a role to play. And I believe that as we are talking about the youth, we should consider what we also need to do with the media and how they'll be able to convey this message back home for our member states will be able to implement the decisions that is being taken here. So I will also say if in future, ADB in a program like this, during the opening, the president said, we introduced some few young people who have succeeded. But looking around, how many young people do we have? Out of the 53 states, we only have 4 people that they were demonstrating. What about the rest of the other countries? Do we have a role model that they can look at that will be able to help the others in other states that they can also make some impact? So in future, if we can have an exhibition from every country, those young people that ADB have supported, that they can come with some kind of talent, of idea, of business proposal that will be demonstrated. And here we have a lot of financial institutions here. They could just go to their booth and look at their idea that they have and the kind of business they want to develop, and they may get some financial support for that stance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your comments. A really good one. There are definitely multiple partners in the development process. It's not just government, definitely traditional rulers, the media, civil society, private sector. There's a whole list of them. I have made note of your comments on the need for exhibitions. And please, if you do attend the Africa Day events today, we have brought 2% from 4 African countries, 4 young contestants who are finalists. We put out a competition called The Africa of My Dreams, because many times we speak to the younger generation, but it's also time for us to also hear from the younger generation what their dreams, what their aspirations, what their hopes are. So please come out today, later on today, and be a part of this event where we'll be honoring 4 of 2,000 contestants who put in for this particular event, and I look forward to seeing you there, definitely at that event. So, nice comment, question right over here. I'm missing the women in the house, so I do hope that there's a question from some of the, yes, we'll come to Nana in a few moments.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm Roger Kalua from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And thank you to the panelists for the speeches. Permettez-moi de me tenir sur les épaules de Son Excellence John Mahatma pour adresser ma question à la fois à leurs excellences Ofor Atta et Diallo. Nous parlons de l'Afrique, l'avenir de l'Afrique et tout. Il y a un aspect, à mon avis, à mon humble avis, qui paraît être laissé de côté, c'est l'aspect pluriel de l'Afrique. Qu'est-ce que j'entends par l'aspect pluriel de l'Afrique? C'est que l'Afrique,
by the diversity of Africa. In fact, Africa is a flurry. It is more than 52 countries, actually, and those 52 countries have different realities, cultural realities, anthropological diversities, and they are all very different. So when you have efforts to move forward in a part of Africa like Ghana or Nigeria or Kenya, as it were, there are some African countries that are left behind, which, in my view, seem to be dragging their feet. And the fact that these countries are dragging their feet, in my view, actually delays those moving forward. It impedes their movement. And so regarding dialogue or genuine discussion, as suggested by Minister Atta, really, what would you advise? What would you recommend to the other countries at a regional or continental level that seem to be dragging their feet? Because the fact that they are dragging their feet, they are actually bringing everybody down, so to speak. When we look at the various development reports, there is a leapfrog, so to speak.
Thank you very much. Honorable Oforiatta will respond to that in just a few moments, and then we'll take a question from Nana right over here.
Good morning, everyone and excellencies. My question has to
Your
do
name?
with regulation and
Your
the
name?
Nana Spio Gabra. Good morning. So my question has to do with the readiness of governments in terms of regulation. A lot of the jobs of the future are going to have to do with things like e-commerce, or will be leveraging social media or technology platforms. And many of us, for example, this week have received notifications about the new regulation that's been imposed in the EU, for example. So I just wanted to know what governments are doing to prepare in terms of regulation for the jobs that will be leveraging technology going forward.
Thank you. Right over here.
Thank you. My name is Yves Tokba. I'm from DRC, Congo. I am a student here at Busan National University. I live in Korea. I'm happy to attend to this conference today. I have 3 questions that I am trying to address to all panel. The first question is, when we talk about, I am first academic. I don't have a lot of experience, but all my comment based on, focus on evidence, academic evidence. My first question is, when we talk about industrializations, is a good question for African Development Bank, because today we find a very focus in Africa on the sector of services, which is not good for the development if we try to learn from Korea experience. But there is one point to really point out here when we talk about the industrializations. Which part of this industrialization is it innovations or imitations? Africa needs innovation or imitation? That's a very good question, because most of the time I see, okay, we need the 5th industrializations, revolutions. It is okay, but is it really wanted for Africa? And the second question is, when we look at the Korea experience, what we can learn from Korea experience is the role played by the government. We can see there that Korea had one minister called the Minister of Strategy and Finance, which played a very important role in the development of Korea. And the next question is, where is the place of the government? Entrepreneurship is okay, but how the government can create opportunity for jobs in the countries, which is a very deep question for Africa as well. The next question is,
actually, I think that's
the last one.
I think that's your third question. So
the third question. Yeah, the last one.
No, I think you already asked your third question. So. Great questions. Let's come back to the panel and allow the panel to deal with those. Thank you very much. Very, very good questions.
Okay. maybe let me address the question about diversity. That is Africa's strength. It should be a strength. But unfortunately, it's largely remained untapped because of the strictures that we've created across the continent. And so, one, our people are not able to move freely across the continent. Goods and services are not able to move freely across the continent. And so those strictures make it difficult for us to exploit the diversity of talents and cultures that we have on the continent. Luckily, there's movement going forward. Like we talked about, Continental Free Trade Area. My country and Kenya are among the first to have ratified the protocols and deposited our instruments. In 2016, when I attended the AU conference, we discussed the protocol on free movement. And this has been a very irksome one because Aliko Dangote does not hesitate to always talk about his experience in South Africa, where he came off his private jet and grabbed one of his passports and got to immigration. And apparently he wasn't the one that had his South African visa. And so here was the richest black man in the world, could not enter South Africa, an African country, because he took the wrong passport from the plane. And so it's something that definitely has affected the movement towards allowing our people to move freely. And so I came back home, and despite the fact that some countries developed cold feet and refused to go forward with ratifying the protocol of free movement, we decided in Ghana that we were going to open up to all African passports. And so today in Ghana, if you travel to Ghana and you're an African passport holder, you can get your visa on arrival when you get to Accra. You don't need to apply for the visa before you fly. But he was talking about countries holding back the progress of Africa. And yes, it's true, governance is at the basis of it. Democratic consolidation is important. My country has seen the most rapid growth in its economic history since 1992, when we entered the Fourth Republic, and have been having regular elections and changes of government through the ballot box. Ghana has grown more rapidly and moved more people out of poverty in this period of our history than in any other period of our history. And so democratic consolidation is important towards forward movement, and especially for the country where they come from, DRC. I mean, that is one of the major drawbacks of that country. Potentially the richest country in the world in terms of natural resources. And yet, because of issues of democracy and governance, that country is one of the major sick men of Africa. I mean, elections can take place because president says they can't find money to hold elections. And so because of that, I mean, the government overstays its mandate. I mean, it's just one of the, stories in Africa that we cannot be proud of. And so these are issues that I think are important. We must ensure, and it's happening, most countries are following the path of democratic consolidation, and you can see the progress that is happening. And so we must ensure that the protocols that we have to undertaking in elections and good governance are implemented. And as presidents, we should be able to tell our peers when they go wrong. Unfortunately, that is not the case. Often there's a certain reticence to say in the face of colleagues who are erring, that they're going down the wrong trajectory.
Thank you very much, President Mahama. Madame Diallo, we'll come to you.
With regards to the problem of differences in development levels amongst countries, I think that the question raised was, how are we going to move together, develop together as a whole continent? That's where regional integration should be of the essence. It's true, as the speaker before me said, political stability and strengthening of democracy have an important role to play, but it's also important for Africans to understand that in order to change the economic situations of our countries, we can't just imitate others or think we can just do what others do. We need African solutions for our problems. And if we have regional integration, well-developed regional integration, look at the case of West Africa. We have ECOWAS, we have a common passport. That already is a great step forward. If we are able to do this kind of thing, we will be able to move forward together. And I think that what holds us back the most is, of course, it's true that we fell behind for many years because of political stability, and we need at some point in time to distinguish between true democracy and pretend democracy. True democracy is to have elections that produce results that are accepted by all so that we can keep moving forward, so that we're not always dragging behind saying what was done, what hasn't been done. We have the experience of developed countries where elections don't always take place like they should. We saw this recently in a country where there were problems, but that doesn't stop countries from moving forward, and this is a crucial problem for African countries. I also think that the fact that we want to find solutions today doesn't mean that we should do what the others do, trying to put this and that into place like they do. We really need to identify the real problems and then try and find solutions to them. Development, it's true, is important, but there are requisites. If we don't look at what is required, we can't move forward. We have the issue of democracy, strengthening democracy in Africa. We also have to look at the fact that in the hinterlands of our country we need strict management of the affairs of the state, transparency in public finance, macroeconomic stability, investment in infrastructure, economic infrastructure, road infrastructure, technology, research. All of these are factors that can contribute towards the economic reforms of a country. So the issue of domestic instability and development, but also regional integration. That is what will help us move forward together. I think we can get back to the other questions later. I'm not sure. There were other questions asked.
Thank you very much, Madam Diallo. Just very quickly, members of the panel, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, pros and cons. We've talked about the free movement of people, goods, and services across borders, and that definitely is something that Africa needs to aspire to. But there's also the element of protectionism. How do we, how do they both meet? Pros and cons here.
We've been struggling with it in West Africa for quite a while. And our major problem in West Africa has been Nigeria. Nigeria has what they call a prohibitions list. And so even though we have a protocol that allows goods to move freely in West Africa, Nigeria says no furniture should come from any country. That includes West Africa. No textiles should be imported into Nigeria. And so that has been a major problem going forward. Even in negotiations with our European partners, the EPAs, after we had negotiated a West Africa-wide EPA, Nigeria developed cold feet and refused to sign. I noticed that the same thing has happened again with the CFTA agreement, and that is because the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria believe that a 150 million market reserved to themselves alone is a much better prospect than 1-point-something billion market. I can't see how they can justify that stand. And so, yes, we've taken the first steps, but the important thing to notice is two of the major economies in Africa, the two biggest,
South Africa and Nigeria,
have refused to sign the agreement. And I think that there's a certain responsibility they have to be the drivers of the economy in their various areas. I mean, look at the work Japan has done in Southeast Asia in terms of building the economies and driving the economies and investing in all the countries, that you have in Southeast Asia, which has given them some of the leverage that they've been able to use to leap forward. We must have those kind of countries that are helping to drag everybody along. And in West Africa, Nigeria must be that country.
But
Nigeria has nothing to fear from Ghana.
President Mahama, optics is reality.
Yes.
What do we need to do to change those optics and influence Nigeria and South Africa to make a different decision?
Well, I believe that the reality is that for manufacturers in Nigeria, a 400 million West African market is a much better prospect than a 150 million market. And the point is, who really has the capital to compete with you in that market? I mean, not Niger, not Burkina Faso, not some of the other countries we have. Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire are the next largest economies, but even then, I mean, compared in capital and investment that can be raised, we don't come anywhere near Nigeria, so there should be absolutely nothing to fear. The thing is, protectionism is good for a period, but it leads to inefficiencies. There's no efficiency in production and all that. So you protect the market for a while to give a certain leverage for takeoff, but afterwards you must open it up so that you're able to take advantage of competitiveness to be able to grow your industries. We have a growing pharmaceutical market in industry in Ghana. We're able to produce analgesics, antibiotics, and some of the basic drugs, antiretrovirals and all that. And if the West African market or the African market were open, I believe that my pharmaceutical association can be able to produce, scale up and be able to produce much more for the whole of the African continent than they are currently doing for the Ghanaian market. And so, yes, I believe free trade is the way to go. There's no room for the kind of protectionism that we're seeing on the continent.
Thank you very much, President Mahama. Honorable Oforiatta.
I mean, I'm right behind my president here. There's no question about that, except, of course, multilateralism and free trade, it's certainly under siege these days from the US, etc., etc. But I think maybe, a key role that we have not leveraged on is really the club of finance ministers, in terms of talking together, meeting, and having an appreciation of a common strategy as to how the economies can grow. And we are beginning to get a sense of that. The Compact of Africa has about 10 countries in there, and the finance ministers have met a few times. Just think through how to stabilize their economies, how to exchange views on domestic revenue mobilization. Now, that type of relationship builds trust and may lead to sort of unbundling some of the uncertainties of that. Also, for the first time, the finance ministers are being brought to the table at the AU. It's always been an area for the foreign ministers to play, because we began to question if we are going to tax ourselves 0.2% of our trade proceeds to go to support them, then we in finance should begin to now have an economic agenda as to how best for the AU to manage itself. So I think in the years coming, you are going to see a certain coalition of philosophy and strategy, which can then be easier in the various cabinet rooms to talk in the same direction. So I'm very, very hopeful about that. And it leads to our beginning to think of the whole concept of regionalization and creating economic freedom for our people to operate. So we can look at tax policies in a way in which we reduce them, but then we have technology to be able to broaden the base. We can share ideas about how the multinationals are doing and compare various treaties or contracts we have with them so that there will be a certain opacity or openness. And I think that's the era we are moving in. I'm pretty comfortable that, the CFTA, it was signed by 44 people in March in Kigali. I suspect will come around to everybody toeing the line in due course.
Thank you very much, Honorable Foriata. Actually, at this point, Madam Diallo, I want to diverge a little bit away from this. We've said that the future of work and the future of industrialization in Africa is young. The greater population of our continent is below the age of 30. That being said, how can we create jobs? How can we increase productivity? How can we promote entrepreneurship when we're dealing with usurious rates of interest, double digit, with a young population that have no access to collateral? What is it that we can do to provide the younger generation with single-digit loans that can propel entrepreneurship at that level?
Je pense que ça c'est le cœur du problème.
I think that's the crux of the problem in Africa. How are we going to guarantee that Africa's youth has a future, a stable future? There are a set of factors we need to take into account. First, we need to produce an inventory of the past. Why are our young people not trained enough? What type of training do they require in order to deal with the lack of training that came before? This is one of the aspects. And then the state has a fundamental role to play. What should the state do to implement the required infrastructures that will structure and promote economic development, the development of entrepreneurship for our youth? So a number of different factors must be taken into account. Investment in infrastructure. We know that in order for businesses to be created, we need energy, we need finance, we need transportation. So the right infrastructures in order to allow for development of small companies, that may be the solution to youth unemployment. But that in and of itself is not enough. Today, what we need to do is, if we really want young people to remain in our countries, we need to give them hope. How do we convey hope to young people? Well, we can do something very simple that all governments can do. I think, first and foremost, we need to order our countries. We need to make sure that people believe in the economic system in the country. They need to believe there's a future, that they have a place in the system, and that is the role of the government. The government has to implement the structural reforms that are required in order for solutions to economic development to be found. So there are a number of different aspects. We need to mobilize domestic resources. Very often we say, let's wait for partners to fund this and fund that. No, let's mobilize enough domestic resources to begin with. Let's show our youth that in order for us to have jobs, of course we need to be competitive, but the state is also providing the necessary framework and infrastructure, so let's give them hope. Secondly, I think the state has an obligation. It needs to ensure that development isn't all in the hands of the public sector. It needs to create favorable conditions for the private sector to be able to develop. There needs to be this perspective so that we can compensate for the lack of employment in the public sector. How do we do this? Well, there are a number of prerequisites. The state must promote competition. It must create and implement financing mechanisms so that businesses can be established. And we need employers, potential employers, to have the means that will allow them to set up businesses that will exist for a long period of time. So promote competition, transparency. It is only through competition that we can further strengthen these structures. It can't always be the state that ensures the functioning of the economic system. It needs to focus on the large structuring investments that will create transparency in public management, economic stability, but also make sure that there is a dynamic private sector that will also do its part. These solutions, holistic solutions, are the ones that are required. There's a very large gap we are dragging behind, and so there are a set of actions that are required for everything to function smoothly. I believe that stability, however, is the economic and political stability of our countries is the most important thing in Africa.
Thank you very much, Madame Diallo. Quite a bit of information there. You said something about infrastructure, and I found it quite interesting that in the different infrastructures that you mentioned, which are all critical, there's one that we haven't talked about here during this session, and that is gray matter infrastructure. Many of our interventions seem to come much later in life of our younger generation. What about developing the gray matter of young children? Malnutrition is a huge problem, and as we know, after the age of 24 months, between 24 and 36 months, if there's stunting of the brain and of the body, it's irreversible after that. So my next question comes to the chief agriculturalist in our midst, President John Mahama, to give us his take on what it is that we must do to mitigate this particular problem, develop gray matter infrastructure so that the infrastructure that we need down the road can actually put to great use. Over to you.
Yeah. Actually, reducing hunger and malnutrition was one of the central cause of the Millennium Development Goals. And I must say that Africa achieved tremendous progress in reducing the number of people hungry and reducing malnutrition. Ghana was one of the first countries to achieve the target, and we achieved it before 2015, before the target date, and so we're giving an award for that. But one of the developments that have taken place that are creating a continuous reduction in malnutrition is Ghana's, what we call Ghana's school feeding program. And children in Ghana, 1.5 million of them, are given one nutritious hot meal a day. And so, one, it encourages, especially in the rural areas, for parents to push their children to go to school because at least one meal is catered for by the government. And so you see that enrollment has gone up. And because of the nutritious meals, I think that it's made malnutrition go down. But in terms of our early childhood development in respect of the health systems, having community health nurses who look after mothers both before birth and after birth, and making sure that they're taking the right, supplements to be able to make sure that the child grows healthy is important. We have a soya mix, a nutri-mix, that is given to mothers who have had children, where they mix it in the food when they start to wean the child in order to make sure that the child is getting the right supplements while growing up. Because like you said, after a period, once stunting, takes effect, there's nothing you can do to change it. And so you find that a child is dull in school is because at a certain age in life, the nutrition that was needed to be able to build the gray matter, in the brain to be able to have a stronger cognitive power did not exist. And so, once that is done, then, the child just sails through school. And unfortunately, like I said, we have an educational system that is pushing everybody towards university education. And we don't have off-ramps where children who do not have the capacity to do a university education are able to exit and use their talents in other ways other than just going through that kind of education. So reordering our educational system is also important, while making sure that at the lower early ages we're able to give these children the kind of meals that they deserve to be able to grow.
Thank you, President Mahama. Honorable Oforiatta, I need to come back to you here to talk specifically about how much it is that we're putting into education. Right now, on average, we are not meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goals in terms of how much it is that we're required to spend in education. Quite a number of countries actually spend less than 2%, some even 1% of their GDP on education. How can we develop a workforce of the future that is fit for purpose and propel and accelerate industrialization when we're not developing human capacity and putting the kind of monies that we should into education? I'm sure the Ghana experience is different, but again, this is a perennial problem that stares us in the face, for which we've done very little over the years.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a challenge when you. Let me give some statistics, for example. I mean, I think Ghana, we are doing quite well, but in reality, when you get into government and between the payments for interest for your loans, the wages for your civil servants, combined, it's over 80% of the revenues you have mobilized. You have a challenge. And then the issue of what do you do with the balance? And I think that essentially is what most African countries are going through, how to reorder this expenditure and also how to really enhance domestic revenue mobilization. Because my suspicion is that all things being equal, they might do the right thing, but we have structures that are just not helping with that. But it's a key issue. So for the AU or AFDB, the discussions on domestic revenue mobilization, how to really bring technology to bear, will lead to reordering, that statistic that you are talking about. And it's key to, of course, the leadership and vision is important, where you then make choices. We had to make a choice about financing senior high school education. And it's a choice that we had to make. So you then hope the leadership on the continent will move towards realizing that the core to our economic emancipation is our people. And therefore, we should put the resources behind them.
Thank you very much. We've almost run out of time. Actually, we have run out of time. So I'm going to give our panelists 60 seconds to 90 seconds to provide your closing comments and synthesize what you consider to be the most important takeaways from this panel. And I'm going to start with Madame Diallo, and then we'll work our way backwards to President Mahama. 6 seconds to 90 seconds.
Merci. 6 secondes, c'est un peu juste, mais je vais essayer de m'y conformer. Industrialisation comme solution au développement économique de l'Afrique, oui.
Of course, we have the preliminaries there. There are prerequisites that are required. We need to learn from the experience of other countries, such as Korea, for instance. As a public leader, there are prerequisites that are needed so that public action would contribute to resolving the problems of African countries. These prerequisites are as follows. 1, political stability for our countries. Second, putting in place the necessary investment in infrastructure in order to facilitate economic development, including technology, research, energy, etc. Also, there are efforts that are needed with regard to macroeconomics, especially macroeconomic stability. And there's effort that is needed with regard to transparency in the management of public affairs. This will certainly help mobilize domestic resources so as to finance development. And we need to have a healthy dialogue with partners so that these partners would not be dictating things to us, but sharing with us.
Can we give Madame Diallo a round of applause there? You all can do better than that. There we go. Thank you very much. Honorable Oforiatta, your closing comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity. But I think what we are really, in my mind, confronted with is a radical shift in educational pedagogy, with people, at the center of it, because we've got the demographics for it to be a dividend or a disaster, and there's an urgent need to move quickly towards it. I think the leadership in Africa should begin, as our president talks about Ghana or Africa Beyond Aid, should begin to be really confident and comfortable about challenging the current economic arrangement and just say, no, this is not how it ought to continue to be. We should be also very clear about incorporating technology, really at the core of everything that we do, because through that we can transmit knowledge, and we can also transmit social services that are critical to the way in which we will grow. The youth, for me, creates a limitless opportunity to leverage off on our limitless resources, and that's how we should look at it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, a very warm round of applause for Honorable Oforiatta. And we go finally to President John Mahama for his closing comments in 60 to 90 seconds. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor. I'm going to steal something that you and I were discussing before this dialogue started, and that was the question about development paradigms. Before, countries were judged by the size of their GDP, the rate of growth of their economies. Eventually, we came to the Human Development Indexes. What is the people's access to healthcare? How many women are dying in childbirth? How many children are living beyond their 5th birthdays? How many people have access to education? And so that became the means of looking at progress in society. And we were discussing, where is Africa going? What is our development paradigm? Do we want to mimic Western society? Glitzy, mass consumption, shopping malls, is that our idea of development? We need to find out, what do we consider development? Recently, the happiness index has come in, and there are people happier in some poorer countries than in advanced countries. I mean, people in advanced countries who you think have everything are committing suicide. They're taking guns and going into their schools and shooting their fellow students. I mean, is that the kind of society we want to develop? And so what is the African development paradigm? And incidentally, today is AU Day. And so I leave you with that thought. Where are we going as African countries? What do we consider the appropriate development for us? What societies do we want to create? Is it Westernization and all the Western influences, or we have a defined African development paradigm that we're working towards? Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, President Mahama. Well, I'd like to close with these comments. We've talked about really excellent ideas here: the need for innovation rather than imitation, true democracy rather than pretend democracy, a dynamic integrated economy rather than protectionism, leveraging the influence of our finance ministers, conveying hope to the younger generation, developing the grey matter infrastructure of our children, and as President Mahama just said here, creating a balance between the need for development and a happiness development index. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a wonderful time with you today. Thank you very much for being with us. I'd like to close by thanking our very distinguished panel here, Madame Kani Diallo, the distinguished Minister of Planning and International Cooperation in Guinea, and Honorable Kenneth Oforiatta, the Honorable Finance Minister of Ghana, as well as the former President of Ghana, President John Mahama. Thank you very much for being part of our panel today. Thank you for your contributions. Have a wonderful day. But before we close, I just want to say that there will be an event taking place in the next 5 minutes, which I highly encourage you to attend. It's the AFDB-ADBI joint side event right here on this Africa Day celebration. Again, later on we'll have Richard Bonner. If you missed his performance last night, I encourage you, don't miss that today, and the fashion show that we will have closing out these annual meetings of the African Development Bank. Have a wonderful day. See you around.
It was a pleasure.